Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first parallel session on provider registration unpacked, registration and registration renewal. This is a parallel session particularly targeted for home services providers. So welcome to our session this morning. I'm Anthony Speed. I'm the Executive Director for the Quality Assessment and Monitoring Group in the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. So thank you everyone for joining this morning. I would also like to welcome with me in the session this morning Robert Day. Robert is the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Health and Aged Care, and Robert's going to be joining me for a part of the presentation later today. Robert leads the Harmonisation and Regulatory Strategy branch in the department. I'll also have a couple of panel members join me from the Commission later on in our presentation. But before we get to our panel session, and there'll be an opportunity for questions from the floor for you later in the session, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you around those questions. Let me provide a presentation on what registration unpacked will look like for you as providers, and I will begin by providing an overview of the role of registration, and I'll discuss how existing aged care providers will be considered as registered providers in accordance with the transitional arrangements of the new Act, as well as touching on the process for new providers. We'll also be providing an overview of the process for registered providers to seek renewal of registration, and outline a revised audit approach and how the outcomes will inform provider registration decisions. And of course we'll end this session by highlighting the process for seeking a review of Commission registration decisions. As I mentioned, at the end of the session there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers, and a panel that'll be preceded by a panel discussion. So in preparation for the questions and answers, please go to this session in your conference schedule, and once in the session you'll see the live Q&A happening now. Please click on that banner and you'll be able to submit a question. Now, while we'll be going into a bit of detail today about the process for registration, it's really important to note that there are still several components of the presentation that will remain subject to decision of government and may of course change through passage of the legislation through Parliament. So, what is registration? A key change to be introduced to the new Aged Care Act is the introduction of a single universal provider registration model. The registration model will require all providers to be registered under by the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission to deliver Commonwealth-funded aged care services. Now, providers must register in one or more provider registration categories based on the service types that they intend to deliver. And the provider registration category will determine which obligations and conditions that those providers must comply with. Registration streamlines a provider's obligations and interactions with the Commission where they are delivering services across multiple categories. For example, where a provider is delivering Commonwealth Home Support Program services or home care services. And the services delivered under each of these programs will inform the registration categories that will apply to the single registered provider. These providers currently have obligations under a funding agreement for their registration streamlines obligations and interactions with the Commission where they're delivering services across multiple categories. As I said, for example, where they're delivering CHSP. And obligations under a funding agreement for their CHSP services or under the new Aged Care Act for their home care services will be consolidated into a single set of obligations under the Act. And the Commission will register providers for defined periods of registration, after which a provider will need to seek renewal of their registration. Now, through this approach, provider suitability, viability and capability will be tested by the Commission at the entry point into the sector and at regular intervals thereafter. And this will help safeguard older people by making sure only those providers who can demonstrate their suitability are able to register and remain registered to provide aged care. This differs from the current arrangements where suitability is determined at the entry point and is not retested at defined intervals. Currently, the Commission is responsible for identifying changes in provider suitability based on provider reporting and other information that is gathered by the Commission. And we take risk-based action in response to that information, rather than providers being responsible for demonstrating their suitability to the Commission at regular intervals. The registration model will ensure greater transparency, regulatory intelligence and oversight. And this is because the Commission will have greater visibility of who is operating in the sector and the funded aged care services that they are delivering. And the Commission can respond proactively to emerging risks in the sector. So who will registration apply to? As mentioned, under the new Act, registration applies to all existing aged care providers, including residential aged care providers, Commonwealth Home Support Program providers, home care packages, providers of short-term, the restorative care program, of the transition care program, multi-purpose services and the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Flexible Aged Care program. Let's start by having a closer look at the end-to-end registration cycle, which I'm going to cover in more detail during this session. The registration cycle includes initial registration of a new entity, deeming of an existing provider, renewal of registration before the end of the provider's registration period, variation of the provider's registration, which may be following a request by the provider, or it may be initiated by the Commission. Suspension or revocation of a provider's registration, which may also be provider or Commission initiated, and where there is a revocation of registration decision, this ends the registration cycle and the provider ceases to provide Commonwealth funded aged care permanently. The Commission will be monitoring registered providers to detect and understand risk to older people related to the provider's compliance with their obligations and their conditions. I know this is a busy slide, but the registration process commences when a new entity seeks to provide Commonwealth subsidised aged care services. They can apply to the Commission by being a registered provider by submitting a registration application form, and the registration application form will include information such as the categories in which the entity is seeking registration, the service types that they intend to deliver, the details of any residential care home where residential care is intended to be provided, and any other information required by the Commission so that we can make the registration decision based on the requirements set out in the Act. This will include details about each of the entity's responsible persons, associated providers, and information about the entity's commitment, capability and capacity to deliver funded aged care services in the intended service types. Now, you may be wondering what I mean by an associated provider. This is a new concept to be introduced in the Act. An associated provider means an entity that delivers services on behalf of a registered provider, such as a subcontractor, for example. Associated providers will not be required to be registered, and the registered provider will be responsible for ensuring associated providers comply with their relevant obligations that ensures the safety and quality of all services. Registered providers cannot contract out their legal responsibilities. However, of course, in the future, associated providers may decide to apply to become a registered provider themselves. The provider registration categories and service types are grouped according to common characteristics, associated risks, and the obligations on providers that address those risks. The information required in the application form will therefore vary based on these registration categories, and we will be requiring additional or more detailed information on those categories where there is an associated higher risk. On registration requirements, the Commission will consider the information given in the application form and any additional information that we may request from the entity, and decide whether to register that entity as a registered provider and which categories in which they are registered. This decision will be made based on the registration requirements set out in the new Act. This includes general requirements such as suitability of the entity and each of their responsible persons, as well as category-specific requirements. For entities applying for registration in categories 4, 5 or 6, there will be a requirement to have an audit against the strengthened aged care quality standards. Now, where a decision is made to register the entity as a registered provider, the Commission will determine the registered period. As per the current accreditation process, for a new provider registered in Category 6, the registration period will generally be for a period of 12 months. And for a new provider registered in Categories 1 to 5, this will generally be for a period of 3 years, based on any identified risks. The Commission will give the provider a notice of decision to record their registration details, which will be entered into a provider register. And to safeguard older people receiving aged care services, the provider's registration will be subject to obligations and conditions of registration. Now, for existing aged care providers, transitional arrangements will be put in place to ensure that there is no impact on continuity of care for older Australians receiving services. And I'm going to ask Robert Day from the department now to provide a bit more detail shortly on the deeming process. Before then, let's talk about the approval of residential care homes. Where an entity is seeking to register as a new provider with a new residential care home, the new home will be approved as part of the registration process. Existing approved residential care homes will not need to be reapproved as part of the renewal of registration process, or where there is a transfer of a residential care home. I will cover shortly a separate variation process which allows for a provider to apply to the Commission to remove or add an existing approved residential care home to their registration record. Let's talk about renewal of registration. Prior to expiry of the registration period, the Commission will initiate the registration renewal process. The Commission will advise the provider of the timeframe for commencing a registration renewal application form. The Commission will then advise the provider of the timeframe in which they need to complete and submit the registration renewal application form. And these timeframes will depend on the provider's registration categories and whether an audit against the quality standards is required. And this process may commence up to 18 months prior to the end of the registration period in certain categories. Where a decision is made to renew the registration of the provider, the Commission will determine the registration period, as I said. This will generally be for a period of 3 years, although the Commission can shorten the period in response to identified risks. Like the registration process, the Commissioner will issue the provider and a new notice of registration decision and update the registration details in the provider register. And the provider's registration will continue to be subject to the provider meeting its obligations and, of course, the conditions of registration. And I'll cover the renewal process in more detail. But let's talk about the obligations framework and the conditions of registration. Registered providers will have certain obligations and conditions of registration. Some conditions will be imposed on all registered providers. For example, compliance with the Statement of Rights and the Statement of Principles, and the Aged Care Code of Conduct, serious incident management and notifications and complaints. And some will be category specific, only applying to certain providers. For example, as I mentioned, the requirement to comply with the aged care quality standards. The Commission may also impose conditions on the registration of a provider. So, for example, conditions relating to the geographic location of the provider, or the service, or the number of older persons the provider can deliver services to. And this is similar in some instances to the current sanctions powers under the existing Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Act. Another example would be a condition that restricts the service types that can be delivered within a particular provider registration category. Or conditions where an issue is being addressed through a regulatory or enforcement pathway, such as a condition that a registered provider must appoint an advisor for a specified period, for example, or provide specific training to aged care workers. These conditions will be risk proportionate and only apply where relevant to the registered provider and the funded aged care services delivered. The conditions applied will assist the management of risks of harm inherent in the delivery of aged care services. Let's talk around the variation of registration. Under the Draft Act, a provider's registration may be varied either by the provider or on application of the Commission through a variation process. The Commission may vary a provider's registration to alter or revoke a condition of registration imposed by the Commission. It may vary a registration to impose a new condition of registration, or remove the provider from being registered in a particular provider registration category. Or it may reduce or extend the registration period, or indeed remove a residential care home approved in relation to a particular provider. For example, where there is a high level of risk driven by a provider's inability to take corrective action to manage specific events or issues, we may impose a condition requiring a provider to appoint an advisor to ensure that certain actions are being taken. And where the provider has done what is required and there are no other ongoing issues, the Commission may vary that registration to revoke that condition. Before the Commission decides to vary the registration in a way that may have a significant adverse impact on a provider's delivery of aged care services, a notice of possible variation of registration will be issued, giving the provider an opportunity to respond to that notice. On provider variation applications, a registered provider may also submit a registration variation form to the Commission which requests a variation of their registration. The provider may seek to register in a new registration category, it may seek to remove a registration category, may seek to approve a new residential care home, or to add an existing approved residential care home, or indeed to remove an existing residential care home. Or the provider may vary or seek to vary or revoke a condition of registration imposed by the Commission. The Commission will consider the information submitted in the variation form and decide whether it's appropriate to vary that registration as requested. The Commission may also decide to impose conditions in response to a provider-initiated variation. This decision will be based on the registration requirements set out in the Act. So where a provider is seeking a registration in Category 6, the category-specific requirements would need to be considered, and this would require an audit. If the provider was seeking to remove a registration category, the Commission would seek to understand the continuity of care for older people receiving care through that provider. And where there is a variation, the Commission will give the provider an updated notice of decision and amend the provider registration database accordingly. Let's talk about revocation and suspension of registration. The Commission can also revoke or suspend a provider's registration where there are very high levels of risk to the safety of older people and risk to their ongoing continuity of care, or the provider is no longer suitable to deliver aged care services. Where a provider's registration is suspended, Commonwealth funding would cease for the period of that suspension. And where there is a revocation of registration, this ends the registration cycle and the provider ceases to receive Commonwealth aged care funding permanently. We will work with the provider and with the Department of Aged Care, Health and Aged Care to strategically manage risks associated with these complex risk scenarios and safeguard consumer safety and ongoing access to care as we currently do. But like the variation process, a registered provider may also request the Commission to suspend or revoke their registration. I've covered a number of the processes this morning and provided information that is new to you. And I want to assure you that the Commission will be developing guidance in relation to this to assist new entities and to assist registered providers with all of the processes that are covered today. And this will include information about our decision framework, and we want to ensure that there is absolute transparency in our decisions and that you have that information available to you. So I'm now going to hand over to Robert. Robert's going to talk about the deeming process for existing providers. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Anthony, and hi, everyone. So Anthony's already taken us through what the process under the new Act will be to apply as a new entrant coming into the aged care system to become a registered provider. The process that I'm going to talk you through is a little bit different. It's the process that those of you who are existing providers will go through when the new Act takes effect. So on the date that the new Act takes effect, there will be a requirement for every provider delivering funded aged care services to be a registered provider under the new Act as opposed to an approved provider under the current Act. And naturally enough, you don't want to have to fill out a whole lot of application paperwork to make that day one goal. I'm pretty sure the Commission doesn't want to have to deal with several thousand applications on day one, and we all absolutely want to make sure that there's continuity of care for people who are getting aged care services already. And so the deeming process is how we solve that particular problem. And essentially what it means is that existing providers under any of the existing aged care programs will be deemed into appropriate registration categories under the new Act. And so that will apply to residential aged care services, short-term restorative care services, transition care, multi-purpose services. And I think particularly significantly for CHSP and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flexible care program providers, it'll involve deeming you into the Act for the first time when the new Act takes effect. So that automatic deeming process is going to simplify, remove the administrative barriers for you moving into the new Act. There won't be a form, there won't be a fee, there won't be a need to submit a whole lot of supporting documentation. It will partly be a legal process, so there will be probably a second Act that goes through Parliament alongside the main Act that talks about what are the transitional arrangements from the current Act to the new Act. There might be people who are working for providers that have been around for the last 30 odd years who were deemed into the current Act in 1997, so it'll be a similar process for that. And it's the same legal process that will mean that people who are currently getting aged care services will continue to get aged care services on day one of the new Act. There'll also be an IT element to making that transition across from the old Act structure to the new Act structure. We'll be doing the first crack of that work ourselves on the GPMS portal, and that's the system that we're building to really try and improve the process and the ease with which you can report information through to us. But we will come out and we will validate that data with you. We'll validate the assumptions that we've used to deem you into certain categories well in advance of that day one, so we can have a conversation if we've got something wrong, or if there will be a small number of providers who've got a particularly complex arrangement and we need to have a conversation around how does this look as we deem it into the new system. A key part of making that transition process as smooth as possible will be having your information in GPMS as up to date as possible, particularly in terms of the contact details and the key roles and responsibilities in the organisation, so that we know who to contact if we need to have one of those conversations or when we're coming out to you to validate the information. We will communicate with you as the timeframe for the new Aged Care Act becomes clearer, both in terms of when it's introduced to Parliament and when the expected implementation date is. We will then communicate with you more clearly about what are the dates and the timeframes for deeming, and we'll then reach out to you directly to have that conversation around this is how you look in the deeming structure, this is what, and to validate whether we're doing that process appropriately. And I guess just to reassert, the fundamental thing that's underlying this is partly the administrative simplicity for you and for ourselves, but also continuity of care, our number one consideration for people receiving care from the current Act to the new one. I'll hand back to Anthony. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to talk now about the renewal of registration process. So as most of you represent current providers who will be deemed as registered providers through this transition process that Robert outlined, I'll now spend some time talking about the renewal process. Whilst this is a new process for providers, the new process is intended to give the community confidence that providers are regularly assessed and remain suitable to deliver aged care services. The Commissioner will invite registered providers to apply for renewal of their registration prior to the end of the registration period. This timeframe for when you receive this invitation will depend, as I said, on your category and other characteristics such as the size and the diversity of the aged care services that you provide. The timeframe is likely to be 3 to 6 months. Prior to registration expiry for providers delivering aged care services in categories 1 to 3 only, and up to a maximum of 18 months for providers delivering category 6 residential care in a very large number of residential care homes. As I mentioned, we will develop guidance prior to the new Act to advise providers when invitations will be sent out for different provider cohorts, for example, large or small ones, for different registration categories, for geographic coverage and those sorts of things. The registration renewal invitation may include details about the information to be provided in the application and details about the audit process for those providers in categories 4 to 6. If the renewal application is not submitted by the registered provider prior to the end of the registration period, the provider's registration will cease. And in those circumstances, the provider would still be subject to registration conditions regarding ceasing of services to an older person. So, for example, if they propose to cease service delivery, they must notify the Commissioner, and they must have a plan to manage the continuity of care for older people who are receiving services. Where a registered provider does elect to seek renewal of their registration, it is currently expected that renewals will take place through the same portal and processes that are currently being considered for new registrations. And like the registration process, the application for renewal of registration and matters considered by the Commission in making a decision on registration will depend on the categories a provider is applying for renewal in. The Department is continuing to refine renewal of registration in the draft legislation to ensure that it is proportionate, to ensure that it is streamlined and recognises existing information held by the Commission. This remains subject to drafting and is ultimately, as I said, a decision of government and passage through Parliament of the new Act. Providers in categories 1 to 3 may be offered an opportunity to complete a streamlined online process to renew their registration, whereas providers in categories 4 to 5 may be required to submit a more extensive approved form and will also require a registration renewal audit to determine their conformance with the quality standards that apply to those providers' registration categories. In deciding whether to renew the provider's registration, the Commission will consider the information given in the form and the outcome of the audit in those circumstances when completed. And in making this decision, the Commission will also consider any information and intelligence that is gathered or received by the Commission during the registration period of a particular provider, such as the routine reporting, notifications, informations received through the complaints process, or indeed the outcome of any risk-based monitoring processes. This means that providers will not be required to submit information that the Commission already holds as part of their registration renewal application. And the registration renewal will be based on the requirements that are set out in the Act. Once the Commission has completed its assessment of the application for renewal, the registered provider will receive a notice of decision outlining the categories and services that they are approved to provide, outlining the period of the registration and any conditions that they must maintain to maintain their registration. The registration period will generally be for 3 years, although the Commission can shorten this period in response to identified risk. And if at any time during this decision-making process the Commission is considering refusing a registration renewal or not registering the provider in a category, procedural fairness, of course, will be applied. The delegate, in that case, will write to you, advise you of their reasons for the possible refusal, and give a provider an opportunity to respond. As with the current Act, where a decision is a reviewable decision, for example, a decision to refuse registration, then the provider will be able to request a review of that decision within a timeframe set out in the Act. Let me talk a little about the audit program. How will it work under these new requirements? The purpose of audit in the new regulatory framework is to inform registration and to inform registration renewal decisions. And it will be used alongside other regulatory information and intelligence that the Commission holds about that provider and about that provider's compliance with their obligations and conditions of registration. The audit process for a new entity seeking registration in categories 4, 5 or 6 will look slightly different to an audit for a provider that is renewing the registration. And so I'm going to talk about the two audits as either a registration audit or a registration renewal audit. For a registration audit, entities seeking initial registration in categories 4 to 6, the Commission will undertake a registration audit to inform that decision, as I mentioned. And the purpose of the registration audit is to understand whether the entity that is seeking registration will be able to comply with the quality standards. For initial registration, this audit would comprise a predominantly desktop review of the provider's governance systems and of their processes for all categories relevant to the quality standards. And this audit would be predominantly desktop, as entities seeking initial registration, of course, would be unlikely to be delivering care and services to older people at the time of their registration. And the audit would likely include a review of information given by the entity in its registration application or in response to any subsequent request by the Commission for additional information. There would also be some interviews with management and the governing body, but not interviews with older persons, as the audit is not collecting evidence of care delivery, given that the entity, of course, is not yet registered. A site visit may be required based on the service types the provider is intending to deliver. For example, to understand whether an entity will be able to comply with Standard 4, a site visit to a residential care home or to a cottage respite facility may be required to understand the physical environment in which services are intended to be delivered. And there will be a single audit report developed for the audit, regardless of the registration categories. The entity will be given the preliminary audit report to review and to respond to, and the final audit report will then be developed by the Commission and given to the to the entity and the registration delegate to inform the registration decision. On to registration categories and audit. As I mentioned earlier, before the end of a provider's registration period, the Commissioner will contact the provider to initiate the renewal of registration process. The audit will then commence for those providers registering in categories 4, 5 or 6. The scope of the audit will be limited to those standards that are relevant to your service type. So let me take you through some of the examples on the slide behind me. You can see which standards apply to the different categories on the right hand of the column of that slide. So for Type A services at the top there, for providers delivering services service types categories 1 through to 3 only, you will not be subject to the quality standards. So there's no audit requirement for you or for renewal of registration. For the Type B providers, where you're delivering service types in Category 4, your audit program will involve one audit. That audit will look at standards 1 to 4. And the audit does not include service types in Categories 1 to 3. For Type C providers, where you are delivering service types in Categories 4 and 5, your audit program will involve one audit. And that audit will look at standards 1 to 4 for all service types in Categories 4 and 5, plus in Standard 5 for your nursing services. For Type D providers, where you have a combination of home and community services in Categories 1 to 5, plus Category 6 service types delivered through the residential care homes, your audit program will involve one audit covering all service types in Categories 4 and 5, and one audit for each residential care home. And each residential audit will look at standards 1 through to 7. And then finally, for Type E providers, where you only deliver residential care and are registered in Category 6, your audit program will involve one audit at each residential care home, and each residential audit, again, will be at standards 1 to 7. On renewal of registration audit, I'll briefly go through this process, and more information on this will be provided at our quality standards session, which is on this afternoon. An audit initiation letter will be given to the provider with information about the audit process. We will also advise you if we need any further information so that we can organise that audit program. We will then hold an opening meeting with you to take you through the process for the audit. We'll check our understanding of any information provided, and we'll arrange the scheduling of interviews. Our evidence gathering process will then commence, and we will meet with the provider's governing body and with senior management to understand governance arrangements, the systems and the processes covering all categories. We will then gather evidence of care delivery covering all service types that may include a site visit. And where auditors identify risk, issues or likely non-conformance when gathering evidence, this will be discussed with you. And we'll also hold a closing meeting with you to discuss our initial findings. We'll then prepare a preliminary audit report to record those findings and the audit gradings for each outcome and standard, and share that with you, the provider. The provider will then have the opportunity to review the contents of that report and to provide a response to the report, and we will then issue a final report, and which will also be given to the Commission delegate, who will be making the registration renewal decision. And so for categories 4 and 5 providers, this will be a single audit report, and for providers in category 6, a report will be prepared for each residential care home. On decisions and outcomes, the audit will determine a provider's conformance with the standards that apply to that provider, and each audit report developed for a provider's audit program will include an audit grade at the outcome level within each standard and at the standard level. And this grade will be exceeding conformance, minor non-conformance or major non-conformance. And the conformance ratings for a residential care home may be published on My Aged Care and may also contribute to the overall star rating. We are still working on this conformance framework for a registration audit, including the publication of the information. But the outcome of the audit is considered by the Commissioner's delegate, who is then making the registration or renewal of registration decision. And as I mentioned earlier, the audit is only one requirement, and that must be considered in the decision. But, for example, we may also consider the suitability and capability to deliver funded aged care services, for example, in relation to the provider's financial management in the delivery of those services. Where there is a finding of non-conformance with the standards, the delegate may make various decisions based on the level of non-conformance found and on the provider's ability to take actions to remediate that identified non-conformance. So outcomes may include refusing to renew the provider's registration, refusing to renew the registration in a particular category, renewing registration in a category but imposing a condition on that registration, or renewing registration with a greater intensity of supervision and engagement with the Commission. While the outcomes of audits directly inform the registration decisions for providers of aged care services, if we detect risks through an audit for registration purposes, we will assess that risk and respond in a proportionate way to the risk. Now, this may lead to a greater intensity of supervision and engagement from the Commission, and the deployment of formal regulatory powers such as monitoring or requiring a provider to take action, or indeed varying a provider's registration, for example, may result as a consequence. And our decisions about the use of these powers, and there may indeed in some cases be parallel actions, are informed by the posture taken by the provider in response to that. And these decisions will be made in parallel to the audit process. So let me touch on risk-based monitoring. Risk-based monitoring of registered providers is one of the first responses deployed by the Commission when we become aware of harm occurring to an older person receiving aged care, such as in a serious incident or in response to a complaint. Through risk-based monitoring, we may at any time identify concerns relating to a provider's compliance with any of their obligations and conditions of registration. For example, a breach relating to the quality standards or to the financial and prudential standards, or to the Aged Care Code of Conduct and requirements relating to continuous improvement. This risk-based monitoring allows the Commission to engage with providers about the concerns that we have, and to hold providers to account when things have gone wrong, and to identify any gaps in the responses being taken and inform any required compliance or enforcement actions. And if through this risk-based monitoring process the Commission identifies concerns about the provider's suitability to provide aged care, the Commission's regulatory response options may include assessing the provider's suitability to remain registered. Now, I appreciate all of that is, particularly the last part of that presentation, is confronting, so let's talk a little bit about procedural fairness and registration. I'm going to wrap up by speaking about this because the Commission has a regulatory bulletin which is in front of you, available on our website, that explains procedural fairness, as well as a bulletin on the reconsideration process. I'd encourage you, if you've not already, to review both bulletins, as those key principles in the bulletin will continue to apply. The Commission must provide procedural fairness to an individual or to an entity whose rights or interests may be negatively affected by one of our decisions. This is a requirement for us under administrative law, and it applies to many decision-making processes in which the Commission is involved, including in registration decisions. And this means that an individual or an entity can expect to be notified of any issues raised through the registration or the renewal process that may negatively affect their interests or their rights. The Commission will notify you of any information that materially impacts the registration decision that we may make about you. And we will also give you the opportunity to comment on any negative information before we make a final registration decision. The procedural fairness step will be given to you in accordance with the legislation and proportional to the seriousness of the impact of the decision upon you. Let's talk also about reconsideration of reviewable decisions. In addition, over the course of this presentation, I've referred to matters that are likely to constitute reviewable decisions under the new Act. For example, a decision to not register an entity or a provider following a registration or renewal of registration application, or decisions relating to the variation, suspension or revocation of a provider's registration. Where an entity or an individual is dissatisfied with certain decisions made by the Commission, they may request a reconsideration of that decision. As per the current arrangements, we expect that the request for reconsideration would need to be made within a specified timeframe of the person being notified of the reviewable decision. And the Commission may also reconsider a decision on its own initiative. Reconsideration of a decision must be made by the Commission's decision-maker who was not involved in making the original decision and who occupies a position that is at least the same level as that occupied by the original delegate who made the decision. The Commission decision-maker would reconsider the original decision on its merits based on administrative law principles. And the reconsideration decision-maker may consider relevant information following the original decision, including all relevant information or evidence given up to the point of the reconsideration decision. And where an individual or an entity is not satisfied with the outcome of the reconsideration decision, they can then apply to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for review of that reconsideration decision. Details regarding the reconsideration and review process, including our timeframes, will be confirmed once the legislation is finalised. As I mentioned, the Commission has published a regulatory bulletin on reconsideration of reviewable decisions on our website, and again, I'd encourage you to have a look at that if you've not already. Now, that brings me to the end of our presentation, but rather than listening to me relay to you the contents of this presentation, is now an opportunity for a panel discussion on our registration arrangements. And let me spend some time with you and invite up to the stage my colleagues, Emma Jobson and Sarah Kelly. Emma Jobson is our Executive Director for Regulatory Policy and Intelligence Group here in the Commission, and Sarah Kelly is our Senior Director for Strategic Policy. So, as a reminder, we will be spending some time towards the end of this session with some opportunities for questions from yourselves, either through our online app or from the floor. So please consider your questions and use the process on our online app. First up, will the slides be available to participants of completion of the conference? We will make sure that that is the case. But before I come to your specific questions, let's go to the panel. And my first question, Emma, is there a difference between an audit under the current Commission Act and what is proposed in the new legislation, and what are those differences, if there are?
Thank you, Anthony. Hello, everyone. Yes, there's quite a lot of differences. There's 4 key differences, which I'll summarise. The current Act provider approval process assesses the suitability of providers to deliver aged care and meet their responsibilities. The new Act will assess the suitability of providers as part of the registration, and audit will be part of that registration process. So this will mean that we'll have if you're in categories 4, 5 or 6, you'll have an audit, and that will inform the assessment of your registration and registration renewal. So that audit will collect and review evidence of the provider's business systems, policies, procedures, and it will test that information through the service delivery arrangements. The second key difference is that audit is at the provider level. So under the new Act, we assess a provider's ability to meet the quality standards. So whereas audit under the current Act assesses the quality of care and services provided through a particular service. The third key way it changes is with regard to accreditation, which is replaced by registration. So under the current Act, audit informs a decision of accreditation of residential services, as you know. Under the new Act, all providers intending to deliver service types in categories 4, 5 and 6 must comply with the relevant quality standards and must undergo an audit as part of their registration or registration renewal process. And there's a fourth key difference as well in how we apply audit, and that's through risk-based monitoring. So currently, if the Commission is concerned that a provider is not complying with the quality standards in relation to their services, we may conduct a review audit or a quality audit at any time. Under the new Act, the Commission will conduct audits as part of registration, registration renewal, and some variation processes. Outside of this, if we have any concerns about risks or compliance with a provider's obligations, we would undertake risk-based monitoring activity. The depth and breadth of that activity will be based on the nature of the risks and issues we identify, and that activity may also have regard to a range of provider obligations and not just the quality standards. So there is quite a lot of change but I think put simply under the new Act, the role of audit is aligned to registration.
Thanks, Emma. Sarah, next question for you. What sort of information do you think providers will need to be giving in the application for registration?
Thanks, Anthony. I suspect most of you are probably more interested in the information you need to provide for renewal of registration. But with regards to both of them, we will obviously do a lot of guidance for people so they understand, but there will be a form. That form will have a range of questions on it. There was an earlier slide that talked about the different factors that the Commission takes into account or will take into account when considering registration and renewal of registration. And really the form will go to providing us with the information that allows that decision making to take place. So some of the questions will be around the service types or the services that you're intending to offer, so that's what's making up your registration application, and then the rest of the information on there will very much be giving us that information to support the decision making. So some of it goes to suitability, so suitability of the entity, suitability of your responsible persons, and then some of the information will go to the other factors that we consider. So some of those are things like the intention to actually deliver the service type, an understanding of the service type that you're wanting to deliver, commitment, capability and capacity to deliver the service type, If you're looking at registration in registration category 6, the details of at least one residential care home. If there's been an audit, if there's audit that needs to take place as well, we obviously won't need that detail through the actual application. That will be available to us separately to take into account. So it's very much information that will support the decision making. And if we need more information, there is the potential for the decision maker to actually come back and seek more or clarifying information as well. For the actual renewal, what we're looking at the moment is if we can streamline that process a bit. So there will be certain pieces of information that either you've already shared them with us, so we don't want to make you share them with us again. So for example, all the details about your responsible persons, we don't necessarily need you to share that with us again. So we're looking so that we can streamline that process as much as possible.
Thank you, Sarah. Robert, next question for you. Are you able to talk to the benefits of the proposed registration model for providers?
Sure, thanks, Anthony. So I think proportionality is a really significant benefit in terms of being able to articulate the obligations on a provider based on exactly what are the services that they are delivering, and particularly in the home care space, not assuming that a provider is delivering the full range of home care services. I think particularly for providers that are sitting in that space the Commissioner showed us earlier, offering both CHSP and home care packages, there'll be a big benefit because you'll have one application, one registration, one set of obligations across both, or across all of your services, rather than having a funding agreement for one part and a set of obligations under the Act for another part. But also then associated with that, hopefully, some greater dynamism in the system, in the sense of it'll be easier to add services to your mix, potentially remove services if the need in your community changes, because it'll be a case of varying to add a category in or out rather than making a whole new application. And then I think finally, when you think about how the registration categories fit with some of the wider changes to the regulatory model, the other thing I'd really call out in the audit outcomes that Anthony mentioned is starting to celebrate excellence. So it's no longer going to be a pass-fail. You can actually get an exceeding grade and being recognised for the great work that you're doing.
Thanks, Robert. And staying with you, you talked about the deeming process. Can you tell us why the department is deeming current aged care providers when the new Act goes live?
Yeah. So I think I gave you the hint about why it needs to happen practically in my response, but the reason the department's doing that work rather than Commission goes to our role under the new Act as system governor. So we've got that responsibility for the system as a whole, making sure that there is continuity of care as we go through this transition process. And so the deeming's a really critical enabler of that for yourselves and for us.
Thank you. And in relation to providers who are in those categories 1 to 3, this might be a question for you, Robert, or Emma, you might want to add to it as well. Why are those providers not required to participate in the process?
So I think from the department's point of view, that goes to the question of proportionality and looking at the level of complexity and the level of risk that's associated with the services in those categories 1 to 3. And so you look at category 1, which is about garden maintenance and domestic assistance and meal delivery, which are both services that you could get outside aged care at any age, and so there is already a regulatory structure around those, and the level of intimacy and complexity and risk associated with those services is less. And so for those services in categories 1, 2 and 3, our judgment at this point is that the other obligations that are under the Act provide a sufficient safeguard, but that once you get to category 4, where you start to deal with personal care, more intimate, and therefore consequently higher levels of risk and complexity, that's where the protections that the quality standards start to step in.
Emma, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to recognise that while the quality standards don't apply to categories 1 to 3, they continue to be captured under the regulatory framework. So We will still be monitoring all providers' service activity through a lot of information and data that comes into the Commission, including complaints, matters regarding the Code of Conduct, incident reporting, other provider reporting that we receive. If we have concerns about any registered provider's performance, we'll be using our monitoring and compliance powers to respond to that. So there is a wider suite of obligations that apply to all providers, while the standards are differentiated across the categories.
Thanks, Emma. And Sarah, next question to you. In one of those slides, I talked about the Commission may impose a condition on a provider following a request to vary registration. Can you give us a bit more information about that?
Yep, and I think it sort of brings to mind the comment that Janet made this morning in her plenary about the fact that the Commission accepts that there will always be risk to some degree within the sector. So I think the ability to impose a condition, a good example, for example, might be if a provider seeks to vary their registration, they want to add a new registration category on. Perhaps there's an audit for that registration category and they're not fully conforming with all of the elements of the standards, but have actually got a really well articulated plan in place for how they're going to deal with that non-conformance. The relevant delegate may decide to agree to the variation, so to register them in the additional registration category, but perhaps do something like place a condition on them that says, you know, perhaps at 3 or 6 monthly intervals, they have to come back and report on their ability to deal with and respond to that non-conformance, so that the expansion of registration categories can continue, but there's a clear plan in place with accountability around dealing with a non-conformance.
Thank you, Sarah. And staying with you, an entity seeking registration outlines the service types that they intend to deliver in their application. And then if the entity is registered, are they able to deliver all service types in the registered categories or only the ones that they intended to deliver?
Yep. So once a provider is registered into a registration category, even though through the registration process they may have nominated particular types that they intended to deliver, they are able to deliver all of the service types in the registration category. They would need to let the Commission know that though, so if at initial registration perhaps they'd only intended to deliver one of the service types, they then decide to change their business model and include another one, they would do a change of circumstances notification through to the Commission so that we were aware of that information and could add the information to the provider register. There will be some circumstances where to deliver some of the service types, they may need to have some kind of agreement with government in place to be able to do that though. So that's a sort of one proviso on that as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And Robert, last question for you for the panel. How will registration decisions be made for new entities who are seeking to operate in aged care services?
Yeah. So once the new Act takes effect, it'll be a case of an application to the Quality and Safety Commission to become registered, and that will either be as a brand new provider or to vary your current registration to add new service categories to it. It is a case of the Commissioner then being satisfied about the criteria specified in the Act about what do you need to be a registered provider. I think, as you said, Anthony, in your presentation, for a new provider coming into the system, that's going to be having a look at what can this provider, this organisation demonstrate to us about their suitability to deliver the services they're proposing to deliver, the suitability of their key personnel to be in charge of and supervising those services. If they've been providing services in disability or veterans care or another related service system, what's the experience been there? Have they proven capacity in that case? And I think the key difference will be where a re-registration or renewal decision is made for an existing provider, the Commission will rely on, to a much greater extent, what do we already know about this provider? What's the track record that they have? A brand new application obviously is going to be based much more heavily on the information provided by that applicant and what they can demonstrate in terms of their capacity and the capacity of their key personnel.
Right. Thanks,
I'd
Robert.
just add, Anthony, that the Commission is developing a suite of resources that will be able to support providers applying for any of the registration processes.
And that will be available as part of our guidance material. I said all guidance materials will be made available as part of our resources. Okay, look, let's take questions from you now. And I know that was a very dense session and a lot of new information was provided. We have a lot of questions that are coming through, and I'll ask my colleagues to respond to some of these, but also there are mics here if you'd like to make a question. Please, I can see someone there already.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name's Jane, I'm with Pop-Up Health in Adelaide. I'm just wondering if there's any discussion happening within the department or the departments in Canberra with regards to one registration across all of the contracts and services that we have individual contracts for with the department, like DVA, aged care, and across the board.
Robert?
So the short answer is yes, but probably not on the same timescale that we're talking about for the new Act. So Anthony mentioned my job title is Harmonisation and Regulatory Strategy, and that harmonisation piece is exactly about what can we do to improve consistency and, where possible, sharing of regulation across those different service systems. So we're doing a piece of work at the moment that is what would it look like if we did mutual recognition of audits across those service systems. But because of the nature of bringing multiple service systems in, we're probably working on a slightly longer time scale than we are for the Act, but it's a live discussion.
Thank you, Robert. And staying with you, we have a very popular question on our app in relation to a comment that Nick Morgan recently stated that it was likely that subcontractors would likely need to be registered providers by 2027, but today I stated in my presentation that this is not immediately required. Are you able to comment on that?
So I think, and I wasn't present at Nick's session, so I don't know the context in which he answered that question. The way that the categories are set up in the exposure draft of the new Act, you have a registered provider who is the entity that is receiving the funding from the Commonwealth, subsidy from the Commonwealth, and they're the organisation that's responsible for the delivery of care services. The associated provider concept captures subcontracted services. So if you're a home support provider and you contract out your garden maintenance to the local gym's mowing, then they're an associated provider of you for that element of the services. And as the registered provider, the legal obligations under the Act still sit with you. I think we envisage a possible future when we get to 2027 in support at home that some of those organisations, like gyms mowing, like meal delivery services, might choose to become registered providers in their own right. But I don't see anything in the exposure draft of the new Act that would make that an absolute requirement. It would be a case of you deciding as a registered provider how you want to deliver your services. Do you want a subcontract, in which case that you'd have that relationship with an associated provider, and similarly a business decision for that subcontracting party. Do they want to get into the main game themselves and become a registered provider, or are they happy to play that subcontracting role to you?
Thank you, Robert. A very popular question on our live app questions is in relation to implementation date for the new Aged Care Act and when the registration requirements will come into effect. I suspect I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you, Robert.
So I can't give you a date. That's a matter for decision for government. What I can say is we've heard a couple of messages really clearly through the consultation process on the exposure draft. And that's, number one, that the sector wants to see the final detail of the Act as soon as possible. And so, as the Commissioner said this morning, we are working to get the final Act into Parliament as soon as we possibly can. We've also heard very clearly that we need to provide time for providers to set themselves up to be ready for the obligations that the new Act will bring with it. And so there's a second decision for government around when, after the Act is passed, will it take effect. Government hasn't told us what that date will be yet, but they have said that they will tell us before it goes into Parliament. And so I guess what you can read into that is there's likely to be a period of time between the Act passing Parliament and the date of effect of the new Act.
Thank you, Robert. Another popular question on our live app is in relation to if you provide services in Category 1 and Category 4, will the standards apply only to the Category 4 service types? Emma, are you able to take that?
Yes, I think is the answer. That's right.
Yes, is the answer. Okay, thank you. Please encourage you to use the microphones as well if you'd like to ask a question, but we'll continue to work through the live Q&A questions. Another popular question. Sorry, thank you.
I just have a clarification around the deeming process. So an existing CHSP provider who provides one or two service types across 1 to 4, when we are deemed, can we provide service across all of the service types, Category 1 to 4, and just let you know that we've added service types? Is that correct?
Robert?
So the way that the deeming process will work is that it will pick up the services that you're currently offering and deem you into those. If you want to then add new service types, that'll be a case of applying to the Commission to vary.
So it's a variation process after we're deemed.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. It's Lorraine Poulos here. I'm just wanting, and I appreciate that maybe you don't have the details as yet, but in home care packages, security of tenure is, really important for home care package providers. Just wondering what that process might look like once supported home commences. Is it likely that their security of tenure is guaranteed and grandfathered, or will they, under the new Act, what are the thoughts around security of tenure? Thank you.
Robert, I think that's a question for you.
So it's a question I don't have all the detail of for you. My expectation at this stage is it will be a bit of a gradual journey. So my understanding is the expectation is from the 1st of July 25, it'll still be a single provider model for support at home for the home care packages part, but that once we get to 2027, it will be a more dynamic environment with the potential of multiple providers serving one individual. I don't think we've got all the detail yet of exactly what that transition is going to look like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark Miller from Silverchain. We have multiple registrations aligned with our state-based operations and legal structure. Is there an opportunity to potentially review that as part of this process into one? And my second question is, the timing for the re-registration audits. You obviously can't do 2,000 audits at the same time.
First part?
So I'll take the deeming part. I think the answer is yes. That would certainly be, our ambition is to give you that opportunity to bring multiple registrations into a single registration as part of the deeming process. For some providers, that's going to be really simple and clear. If you say you're operating home care and resi care under an organisation with the same ABN, it'll be really clear to map those together. If the structure is a bit more complicated, that's where the conversation that we have with you before the actual deeming happens will come in, that you can say, hang on, you've missed the connection to this part of our service, can we bring that into the umbrella as well?
And in relation to the second part, Emma?
Yes.
Sorry, Sarah.
And you're absolutely right. We can't go and do, we can't deem everyone and everyone gets 3 years, and so we're all going out to do the audit at the same time. So the initial registration periods for deemed providers, we will work alongside the department, and that will have to be staggered through the initial periods so that we can manage appropriately the audit load that comes with it, and also the registration decisions as well.
Presumably, I don't know how many audits you do now, but presumably everyone's going to get an audit, which must be an incredible increase in your workload.
There's swings and roundabouts. So there are some services now that through the deeming process may end up in categories 1 to 3 and may no longer have an audit requirement. And then there's obviously all the audit requirements for categories 4 to 6. So there'll be some sort of ons and offs, but yes, we are closely monitoring that.
Thank you for those questions. Let's go back to the questions on our live Q&A function. Another popular question is, will the provider register be made public and indicate the category and the service types? Emma, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think the intention is that it is, yes. I think the exact details of what will be haven't been resolved yet.
And another question is, if an audit is occurring or is required for categories 4 to 6, will these occur concurrently or separately? Sorry, the question's gone, but if an audit is required in relation to categories 4 to 6, and there are a number of audits required, will they occur concurrently or separately?
That's very kind for Anthony to ask this question because he also knows the answer to it. It will depend on the size of the provider. Obviously, there's a very big variation in provider size, and particularly when we look at the audits, as was described before, there'll be an audit activity for each residential care home. So it would depend on the size of the provider. Ideally, they would happen sort of as close together as they could, but in some instances they'll have to happen over a much longer period of time, just purely because of the number of audits involved. But there is certainly a desire to try and collect some information, only once, so that we're using the same information across the audit activity to do with a single provider as well. So it would just depend on the size of the entity.
Thanks. A question from the floor? No.
We can actually hear.
So I'm kind of interested in
Kerry, can you move closer to the mic? Is that
the transparency.
right? Can people at the back hear that?
We can just repeat
No.
the question.
Okay. If you say the question, I'll repeat it.
I'm interested in the transparency and publication of any risk matrix that might be used, just following a couple of...
We'll repeat it.
Say it in a second.
Just following a couple of comments from you, Robert, about risk associated with particular services. And the reason I'm interested in that is because actually the most SIRS...
Oh, we've got sound. So I'll ask you to repeat the question then.
Okay. Okay, I was just asking about the transparency of a risk matrix that's going to be used to determine, proportionate response to risk, etc. Robert, you made a comment that HGM and DA are lower risk, and yes, while they're less complex, actually most of our SIRS come from them. And they're quite serious ones. Obviously, there's a lot of theft allegations, but also, sexual conduct, a whole range of things that come from those services. So interested to see that risk matrix and how that's going to be applied. And then also, we all want to meet quality standards and rise above them. That's our new minimum bar. That's great. But should there be a decision to remove registration from a provider in a rural area where those providers can only actually provide associate providers to deliver services, and those associate providers don't want to step up under the regulations that are now coming? How will consumers be transitioned across to a like service in a safe and maintain continuity of care? I think that's a big issue in rural remote.
Sure.
Thank you. I think just touched on those two questions. To answer them, I'd need to talk about how the Commission does most of what we do, but I will. You would have heard Janet talk this morning about how we respond to risk and the provider supervision approach. and what is a proportionate response is very much dependent on the nature of the risks and the issues that are there, but equally importantly, your or the provider's response to those. So where there are gaps in that response, our response changes. So it is a dynamic and case-based answer. But to your first question about how do we understand risk and assess risk, we are very interested and we're working on being more transparent about that and sharing that information. Anyone who manages risk knows it's dynamic, it's case-based. But yes, we can absolutely share our procedures and how we regard that. I don't think it's rocket science, or it will, necessarily, be something you wouldn't expect. But we get that question quite often, so I think we're quite keen to step into that space and share. And I think the supervision model helps us do that. We're talking about levels of supervision aligning to risk, not as a strict rule, because how we supervise, as I said, is very much related to what is the exact nature of the situation. Going to the last part of your question, particularly in thin markets, this is where often we have services in thin markets in the heightened supervision space, because we have real risks to current consumers, including continuity of care. The answer is complex, but there are a whole lot of strategies that come into play when those circumstances occur. That can include sale and transition of a service, not just moving people out of a service or closing a service. So there's a whole lot of things we look at. We're often working in partnership with the department when those situations occur, because everybody is trying to work towards those services remaining there for that community. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. A very popular live Q&A question relates to what costs will be charged for registration and the renewal of registration processes. Sarah? Or Robert?
I can go. The decision to charge for activities of the Commission is a decision of government, so people, I think, are familiar with the activities that we currently charge for and the current fee structures. So government will look across the range of activities that the Commission will undertake under the new Act, and will make decisions about which ones they're interested potentially in charging for. There'll be a consultation process where we engage with the entities who would be impacted by the charging, which is obviously you, and that ultimately then decisions will be made around things like fees, waiver arrangements for fees and so on, and then they would be introduced. So the answer is simply to the question is government hasn't yet made that decision, but I think I'm right in saying it is very likely that some of the activities will be charged for.
Thank you. Another popular question is, how will providers in categories 1 to 3 be asked to show that they are meeting provider obligations?
I think the answer is the same as what I responded earlier. They'll be part of the ongoing monitoring activities of the Commission. All providers sit in a monitoring category we call surveillance. We receive a lot of information about all providers on a daily basis. So we'll be continuing to use that information to monitor and respond to risk. All our powers apply in the same way to all registered providers.
Thanks, Emma. And I think another question for the Commission relates to social support provided in Category 4, and how will non-centre-based group social support, for example, bus excursions, be audited? How will non-centre-based group social support, such as bus excursions, be audited?
I think while Sarah's having to think about how to answer the audit part of the question, I guess in the interest of transparency, there the version of the registration categories we showed you were updated after the consultation we did last year on the regulatory strategy. Obviously, we've then since had conversations around support at home and the new Act that are putting new input into that. The treatment of social support in the registration categories is one of those things that's come through the consultation as something that we need to think about in a little bit more depth.
And a question for the Commission around revocation. Oh, sorry, Sarah.
The answer, I guess, simply to the audit question, which is also partly because I know that there's an audit session or a standards session after lunch, which I'm sure you're all eagerly waiting for now in 4 minutes. So absolutely ask it then. But I think people would be used to the fact that audit is cognizant of the context in which services is being delivered. And so the evidence that might be available to us to understand how a provider is meeting relevant standards is going to take into account the context that it's being delivered in. And so if a provider was just delivering that element of that particular registration category, the methodology around audit would take that into account.
Thank you. And a question from the floor.
I'm Italia from Multicultural Aged Care here in South Australia. We are an organisation who assists particularly CHISP service providers and HCP. My question goes to the question subsequent, the current question still being answered, in that in terms of the social support group activity programs that have landed in Category 4 and are subject to all 4 standards, the first 4 standards, there are a number of culturally and linguistically diverse specific organisations who currently run only a social support group activity. Now, they're subject to the current 8 standards. We support them. They get through that process, whatever. I guess there's quite a few of them, and looking into the future, I guess we are wondering, how is it that you mentioned, Robert, that there is still some discussion potentially going on? How is it that if an organisation only runs a social support group activity, and there are a number of them, particularly called, just to give some examples, Ukrainian, Latvian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Italian, and Macedonian, etc., there's a range. How is it that social support group, if that's all you provide as a service, how did it land in Category 4? Under personal care, you talked about levels of risk, etc. So just some insight into that, please, or anything further, if you could talk about what you said about the consultation process to date, moving forward.
Look, I think part of the challenge is that social support captures so many different things, and that's one of the reasons why that's one of the groups that's bounced around a little bit in the registration categories. I think some of the feedback that we got that saw it move into Category 4 is both that often social support and personal care get delivered together, not obviously in the group setting that you've described, but in other settings, and also that there is a position of trust and vulnerability that's created through social support that has a risk associated with it that's being managed. But equally, we've heard, there are, and I know them, my previous job in the aged care group was around diversity, so I know very well the role that those culturally specific support groups play, in some ways it's a safe gateway into aged care services, and so that's why it's one of those questions that we still haven't quite grappled with, where it's going to land. Possibly we even have to split social support out into a couple of different categories to balance those 2 different risks. But that's the thinking that we're working through.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we've got time for one last question. Is there no more questions from the floor? I'll take one from live Q&A. A popular question is around revocation or suspension. And will that be applied at provider level or in relation to specific sites or services if there's a decision made to revoke or suspend?
Revocation or suspension by their nature, because registration is connected to a provider entity, would be at the provider level, there is the potential either through registration or re-registration decisions or variations or conditions for the Commission, for example, to decide that a provider can no longer deliver care in a particular registration category. But if there was a decision taken to revoke or suspend, that would be across the entirety of the entity, so the entirety of the provider's operations.
Thank you, Sarah. That brings us to the end of the questions. There are still a couple more questions that are coming through, so continue to do that. They give us useful pointers for our communications. Thank you for attending the session this morning. There are QR codes on the screen here for further information, and please don't hesitate to talk to any of us in the Commission or the Department over the next 2 days in relation to the presentation if you have further questions. Thank you.